I'm so glad that y'all are here. I know that some of you are here because I've seen you in Sunday school almost every week. And you walked with me through the study on the parables. I know some of y'all are here because Spencer made you come. Thank you. I know some of you are here because you either are in the confirmation process or are thinking about getting confirmed when the bishop visits. And some of you are here, I have to assume, because you are interested in the subject and the material of this study. So whatever your reasons for being here, I'm glad you're here. I'm excited you're here, and I'm looking forward to walking these next 4 weeks. Well, today hadn't fully happened. We'll say 4. These next 4 weeks with you as we look at all aspects of what makes the Episcopal Church unique, why we are awesome, why I think we have something really special to offer in the large and vast landscape that is American Protestantism, right? But I think we have some unique gifts and things like that that actually are really cool and help us in our walk with Jesus to grow closer with Jesus. So we're going to talk about all sorts of things over the next few weeks. We're going to talk about sacraments and prayer and theological stuff, and we're going to talk about for instance, what confirmation even is. Why would someone get confirmed? Because again, this is partially a confirmation class. We're going to walk through that. We're going to walk through what we believe about communion and why, and I don't have a prayer book with me, but I should as a prop, because we're going to talk about that today, about the prayer book, and how, I think those are all Bibles and hymnals. No, it's fine. I would just wave it around, so it wouldn't be all that. But anyway, so that's what this class is going to be about. Now, today is one of my favorite sessions because, as I was mentioning, it is all about the history. It's about the story of our church. And it's really interesting history, actually. Now, it's a long history, and so because of that, we're going to necessarily just zoom over a lot of details. There's going to be a lot of this that is going to be painting with an incredibly broad brush. You just have to know that. Okay, anytime you're covering hundreds and hundreds of years in a matter of minutes, you're going to do that. But I hope that you come away knowing something you didn't know before and interested in something that you weren't maybe interested in before. The other thing that I'll say is the history of the church, as we all know, because we're all Christians, we know that Christians can be messy. The history of the church is sometimes very messy. And at the end of today, you may wonder, one of the things you may be wondering about is, okay, so how is the Holy Spirit working through this, right? Where is the Holy Spirit at work in this? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in successive sessions. And I always think that anytime you study church history, the fact that we're still here and God is still present in the midst of us is a testament to how powerful God really is, because the church can be kind of crazy sometimes, okay? And we're going to talk about some of that today. So let us begin, as we always do, by saying a quick prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, I thank you so much for this beautiful morning. I thank you for these friends that are assembled here. I thank you for what we're about to study. I thank you for your church. As messy as it is, I thank you that we come to know you more and love you more in and through it. And I pray that as we embark on this study, you would help illuminate different ways for us, maybe to see things we didn't see before. To find things that we didn't know to look for before, and come away with a greater appreciation of the riches that we have here at St. Richard's and in the Episcopal Church more generally, and the ways that those things and the resources in our church can help us grow and deepen our faith in you. We pray all of these things in your name. Amen. Okay, so as I mentioned, this moves fast, okay? I'm going to probably move slow at first, so I'm going to drink more of this. And then we're going to begin. So, as I mentioned, this started its life as a 20-minute talk as part of like a 16-week youth confirmation course, okay? And it was really initially all about just the Book of Common Prayer, right? What is it? How did we get it? Why is it important? I mean, I know on Sundays, if you're in church, right, we almost do everything nowadays just out of the service leaflet. It's always all printed in there. But there are those red books that are in the pews that we hardly open, but they're important. And that's where all the words in the service leaflet come from, right? Is from the Book of Common Prayer. And the Book of Common Prayer is actually one of the central things about our particular expression of the Christian faith that I think it's marvelous, it's wonderful, it's an incredible resource, and it's so good that all these other Christians took from it, okay? If you've ever been, which we all have, right, been to a wedding, every other denomination just uses our wedding stuff, right, because it's that good. I mean, as a Baptist, I still just use the Book of Common Prayer at you know what I mean? You go to a Baptist wedding and it's still, what are the vows, right? To have and to hold in sickness and in health, for rich or for poor, et cetera, right? We did that. Thank you, right? You know what I mean? So, anyway, so it is an important resource. Now, like I said, today's going to be all about history. It's going to be all about kind of how we got this book, how we came to be as a denomination. And as I said, some of that's a little messy, but we're going to talk about how the Holy Spirit works through imperfect people and imperfect institutions as well in this. The last thing I'll say is, if I can get through all of this in time, and I'm really going to try to, we're going to try something new now. We've got this microphone, okay, that at the end I can turn on, and that way if you have a question, you can speak into it, and not only will we be able to hear it better in the room, because during the parables class that was a bit of a challenge. Someone would make an incredibly astute or wonderful point about a parable, and then I'd have to try to clunkily repeat it back so that everybody else could hear. But now we have the technology, so we can pass around the question microphone at the end. I'll also say that future sessions will be a lot more discussion, well, I won't say a lot more, but more discussion-based anyway than this one will. This is more about conveying information. And then once we get into the nuts and bolts of the sacraments and how those apply to our lives and all that sort of stuff, then we'll have a lot more time to share and talk. And maybe even share and discuss at your tables. So in future weeks, beware of who you sit with. You may have to talk to them, okay? But anyway, all right, so let's get going. Because like I said, we've got so much to get through. So today, we're going to hear that. Can you read that? It's a little dark because it's blue and not white, and I maybe should have changed that. But okay, so today we're going to hear the story of how the Book of Common Prayer and the Episcopal Church came to be, okay? It involves some murder, all right? I know. The Scots and the Revolutionary War, okay? So that's a teaser, right? Yeah, I know. We got whoops for murder. I got to pray for y'all over here in this corner. I had to pray for you. That'll be next time. Good. All right. But first, well, really, if we're going to start, right, we have to start with Jesus. So how did we get here today? Well, of course, the Episcopal Church exists in some sense because of Jesus of Nazareth, right? Because if it wasn't for Jesus, no church would exist. But that's a little bit of a cop-out because we all know that, right? We all know that without Jesus, we wouldn't be here. But it's important to begin there. So we're going to skip over about 1,500 years in between Jesus and this guy, okay? So this is where we're going to begin today, with King Henry VIII. All right, now, King Henry VIII very famously had many wives. And this is already at the very outset, right, we see how the church is a little messy. It's a little messy, okay? King Henry VIII had 6 wives, many of which did not make it, right? We know about that as well. And a lot of people talk about how King Henry VIII declared England a Protestant nation because the Pope would not grant one of his divorces. Y'all have heard that, right? You know, okay. But here's the thing about that. Obviously, granting divorces to King Henry VIII was not an issue for the Pope because he did it multiple times, right? Until he just didn't want to do it anymore. The dispute that was going on was between whether King Henry actually ruled over England or not. Did Henry have a say over what happened there, or did the Pope have a say over what happened there? We have to remember that at this time in history, the Roman Catholic Church was pretty much the church in Europe. I mean, there were the Eastern Church, but they weren't, they were over there, okay, right? So in Europe at the time, the Roman Catholic Church was the church. And not only was the Roman Catholic Church the church, the Roman Catholic Church was also almost the everything. They controlled not just the keys of heaven, so to speak, right? They also controlled land and armies and resources and wealth. And so they were constantly butting up against the monarchs who ruled in all of these little kingdoms across Europe, because the king would say, well, I'm in charge of this here, and the Pope would say, no, and the king would say, yes, no, I'm in charge, and the Pope would say, do you want to burn in hell for all eternity? And it was a very strong card to play, okay? so there was this tussle, all right? So we have King Henry VIII. He had all of these wives because he was trying to produce an heir. He needed a son, and that wasn't happening for him. And so he has this tussle with the Pope, and near the end of his life decides that England is going to be Protestant, not Catholic, because there was this thing going on in Europe called the Protestant Reformation. And I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's back up. We're also going to talk about this guy. This guy is named Thomas Cranmer. Okay, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time that Henry was around, and also Henry's daughter Elizabeth. We'll talk about this. He wrote the first Book of Common Prayer, okay, and this is in the 1500s, okay, 1500s, so that's kind of where we are. So Thomas Cranmer wrote the first Book of Common Prayer, and then there's this guy who's also really important to the story. This is Martin Luther. He very famously had some grievances against the Roman Catholic Church, and he wrote these 95 theses, as we call them, and he nailed them to the church door in Wittenberg, and that's kind of, boom, Protestant Reformation started happening. It wasn't quite as neat and tidy as all that, right? But again, we've got a lot to get through in a short amount of time. So Martin Luther sort of sparks the Reformation, and there had been little kind of Reformation-like things happening before Martin Luther, but Martin Luther really kicks it off. And Luther really just wanted to make the Roman Catholic Church better. That was what he wanted initially. He didn't think that he was about to break open this huge thing where all of a sudden everyone was protesting and breaking off. But nevertheless, that's what ended up happening. And King Henry sees this going on in Europe and says, that is quite convenient. I would like us to be Protestant, please. And that's kind of, oh, there we go. This is probably a quote. You'll notice there are a lot of very inaccurate quotes in this presentation. Okay? So this is basically what happens. So let's talk about Thomas Cranmer. So when England becomes Protestant, you have to remember that at this time, every single church service or anything was done in Latin, right? And unless you were actually a priest or a monk or something like that, you couldn't actually speak Latin. And so you couldn't understand what was going on, but you went to church because you knew you needed to go. And so you would go to church and you would hear the Mass being spoken in Latin. But for the most part, you know, your everyday, farmer who's out there has no idea what's actually going on. They just know that when the bell rings and the communion wafer goes up, they have to look, right? Or whatever. And that's about it. And so one of the things that the Reformation was all about was translating worship into the languages that people actually spoke. And so when Thomas Cranmer sits down and goes, okay, well, what do I do? Because when we were a Roman Catholic country, right, we had to say Mass in Latin, and so now that we're not Roman Catholic, what do we do? So he translates all of that into English, and thus the first Book of Common Prayer is born, okay? And this is actually really, really revolutionary. Like, I don't think we grasp or appreciate how just monumental this really was, but because we are so used to just coming to church and hearing it all in English. We think sometimes the right one isn't in English, right? If you're a 1030 person, right, all of my right one people are you know. I didn't hand out tomatoes before this. Don't throw a donut at me. But no, like if I got up there and started speaking Latin one day, you'd all be like, what is this, right? But that's what would go on. And so how do you think you would have a relationship with God if you didn't even know what was really going on in church, right? So anyway, so this was just huge, okay? Cranmer writes the first Book of Common Prayer. Now, he revises it a few times. This was in 1559. He revises it 3 times before he dies, and they get a little more Protestant each time. But if you've ever wondered, why is it that the Episcopal Church is kind of Catholic, right? If you've ever been to a Roman Catholic service, but kind of not Catholic, this is what sort of started it, is because the first Book of Common Prayer was just a translation of the Catholic Mass. And so we kind of held on to a little more of that tradition than some of our other denominational friends. Now, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, because I'm already wasting too much time back here. Okay, so Protestant or Catholic? This was the question, right? Is England Protestant or Catholic? There were 2 lines of royal families. This was not a decided question. Even though Henry VIII said, yes, we're a Protestant country, you got to think about, like, well, okay, the king declares something, but if you're a priest, like, way out in the field someplace, what does that mean for you, right? Why would you just all of a sudden go, yeah, the king said it, you're right, I'm a Protestant now? You know, you wouldn't do that, right? You'd still consider yourself Roman Catholic. It just doesn't work quite like that. And so even though England was Protestant, that was a little messy, right? Because everyone on the ground is kind of like, what does that even mean? We don't even know what it means to be Protestant, Henry. You just wanted to do your own thing. There were 2 lines of royal families that were sort of divided about this. If you've ever seen the show The Tudors, which that table over there does not need to watch, probably no one needs to. We'd all need to go to confession if you've ever seen that show. It's very saucy. Anyway, so there's the Tudors and the Stuarts. The Tudors, Protestant, Stuarts, Catholic, okay? And even within those families, there was religious disagreement going on. So there were some that were Protestant and some that were Catholic, and they really didn't like it. They fought all the time. And we know about these things from history class, right? This is a famous case in point. Queen Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, was very Protestant, but her half-sister, Mary, was very Catholic. And after Henry VIII's death, his son Edward, whose mom was Jane Seymour, remember there was a lot of wives, okay, was made king. And Edward was only 9 at the time he was made king, okay? But Edward introduced some really important reforms that would kind of stick around that I'm grateful for. For instance, he declared that priests could get married now, okay? That was not something that priests could do before, but because of Edward, I can get married, so that's great. And he also said to people, you're not compelled to go to Mass. Now, what does this mean? Now, it was against the law if you didn't show up in church, okay, before. It was against the law. You'd actually get in trouble. Now, imagine that. And you think pledge cards are bad, right? Imagine if it was somehow against the law. So he said, no, I don't like that. Well, somebody said that. We don't know if he really said that, but somebody said it in his name. Because again, if you're like 9, I don't know if you're really going to be saying those things. But anyway, he decreed you needed to go to church because you wanted to, not because they forced you to. Okay, so those are 2 important things that Edward did. But Edward tragically dies at only 15. Okay? After Edward's death, his fiercely Catholic half-sister Mary takes over. Mary's mom was Catherine of Aragon. That was another one of the wives. Okay? Mary reigned for only about 5 years, but her reign was very infamous, or as I say here, brutal. Okay? Because during her reign, she burned about 280 people, or had about 280 people executed, okay? Which is how she gets the name Bloody Mary, right? Okay. So one of the people that she burns at the stake, tragically, is our boy Thomas Cranmer over here, okay? Who was martyred in Oxford. Oh, wait. There we go. Martyred in Oxford along with a guy named Nicholas Ridley, who is another bishop who was a big driver of the English Reformation. Okay, so Cranmer gets killed under Mary's reign. But Mary gets the flu in 1558, and she dies at only age 42. And then her sister Elizabeth, whose mom was Anne Boleyn, another of the wives, okay, ascends to the throne. And this is we all know Queen Elizabeth, right? Queen Elizabeth I. She took over in 1558. She reigned for 45 years, one of the longest reigning English monarchs. And it was under her reign that things kind of stabilized a little bit. She declares herself the supreme governor of the Church of England. She also really says, look, we really are Protestants now. We are going all in on this Reformation thing. I promise, okay? And again, this has got to be a real quote. I pulled this from a historical document somewhere, okay? But that was Queen Elizabeth. Things stabilized. And under Queen Elizabeth, you kind of get more use of the prayer book across the church. Things like that start happening. And your average English person goes, okay, yeah, maybe we really are Protestant. Okay, maybe we really are. This is good. But during this time, things were still tense. Okay, Elizabeth famously did not produce an heir. That'll always get you into trouble if you are a monarch. And so enters King James to the scene. Okay, King James I, who was a Stuart and Elizabeth's first cousin, settled things down, okay? He was King James VI in Scotland. So this is important to know, okay? Remember what the Stuarts were. Catholics, that's right, okay. So the Stuarts were up in Scotland, and King James was reigning as the king of Scotland. Okay, this is before they were all one thing. Scotland was, part of the United Kingdom, right? They weren't yet united. That happened in the 1700s. This was before that. And so King James was King James VI up in Scotland. But in order to settle things down, they asked him to come down because he was the next in line, right? To come down to England and become King James I of England and kind of like put a stop to this Catholic Protestant nonsense, right? Because he was a Stuart, but maybe he could be a Protestant king, right? And in fact, that's pretty much what he does. He commissions the Bible that we still use, the King James Version of the Bible, right? That was his commissioning. And he kind of calms the waters a little bit. Now, for a little bit of extra context, this was exactly the same time as William Shakespeare was writing, okay? Shakespeare wrote near the end of Elizabeth's reign and on into the beginning of King James's reign. And so that's kind of the time period that we're talking about here, early 1600s. The King James Bible was a huge deal too. I've talked about the prayer book, but the King James Version of the Bible was huge because it was really one of the first scholarly editions of the English Bible. There was another translation of the Bible in English before it, but called the Geneva Bible. But this one was every top scholar of the day worked on the King James Version of the Bible. And actually, if you're a student of Greek, you know that still to this day, the King James renders the Greek better than almost any other translation, even though it's 400 plus years old, which is really amazing. And so it's truly a monumental achievement. And it allowed English people, provided you were literate, which was a big asterisk because most people couldn't read. But if you could read, you could go to your local parish church, and there in your parish church would be a King James edition of the Bible, and you could read it. What's really cool, okay, is that many English parish churches still have their King James Bible, the original one. So what would happen is the Bible would actually be chained to a desk in the church so that it wouldn't walk away. Bibles were very, very expensive things. So it would be chained to a desk. But I've actually seen a parish church in England that has still their original 16 whatever King James Bible chained to the desk in the church, which is pretty cool. Anyway, okay, we gotta keep going. In the end, England was a Protestant country. That's where we're going with this, okay? After a lot of tumultuous time, England ends up a Protestant country. For the most part, right? For the most part. There's always going to be exceptions. There's always people who are fighting. Now, we get to these guys, the Puritans. We know about them because we just had Thanksgiving this week. But there was a group in England who wanted to purify the Church of England. So one of the things that the Protestant Reformation unleashed was this continual reevaluation of the church, whatever that was for you. So if you were, if you were on the continent, that might look like John Calvin going a little bit more reformed than Luther went. Or that might look like this guy named Ulrich Zwingli, who birthed the Baptists, really. And he went a little further than Calvin did, even. And so you have all of this kind of, once you could push back against the established thing, right, it sort of unleashed this habit of doing it. And the Puritans were doing that in England. So even though England was a Protestant country, the Puritans said, you know what, it needs to be kind of more Protestant. And so, as typically happens when people get involved in things, war breaks out, okay? And so the English Civil War happens. The Puritans were led by this guy, Oliver Cromwell. I'm going to skip over a whole lot that's going on here. They kill the king. Cromwell takes over. Cromwell famously did not like Christmas. He didn't celebrate Christmas. He thought that was too Catholic. And I'm just like, man, that is so sad. But there we go, all right? That's the Puritans. They didn't want that. So no more Christmas. King Charles I, who was king at the time, he's killed. I'm sure this was a quote from Cromwell, I'm sure. Okay. So then King Charles II, who has just the most fantastic, I guess that's got to be a wig, but I wish it were natural. That's amazing. But he ends up on the throne, and then he gives us a new Book of Common Prayer in 1662. So this is over 100 years after Cranmer, 100 years after Cranmer wrote the first Book of Common Prayer. We get an update in 1662, and because the English never change, it's still the official Book of Common Prayer in England today. They came very, very close to updating it in in the 1920s. But because the Church of England is still a state church, Parliament had to vote on whether or not they would approve the prayer book, and they didn't approve it. So, nothing makes me love America more than not having to get Congress to vote on a prayer book. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, so they still have the 1662. Now, they don't really use it all that often. If you go to England today and you were to visit a Church of England parish there, from whom we are descended, they would probably not be using the Book of Common Prayer. They've got a thing now called Common Worship, and it sounds actually very similar to what we do on a Sunday morning. It's very, very close. And it's not an official Book of Common Prayer. It's an additional resource because, again, they didn't go through the whole process. Anyway, so there you go. That was King Charles II. Now, after Charles II, we get James II. We have a lot of sequels, okay? During this time, we have King James II. There he is. He didn't last very long. He's deposed by some members of Parliament, the Dutch, after only 3 years of rule. This is called the Glorious Revolution. You may remember this from history class. If you don't, that's fine. We're going to go straight through it. Then there are these two folks, William and Mary. They're pretty important. They are offered the crown by Parliament. Now, William and Mary are not English. They're Dutch, William of Orange, and so they're offered the crown by Parliament and become the King and Queen of England. This is why we have William and Mary, the college in Virginia. So this is about the time, right? They wrote the charter for that. It was named in their honor. Okay. They're offered the crown by Parliament, yet there were some bishops and other clergy who felt that they couldn't swear allegiance to William and Mary. So we're going to pause here for a moment just to say that one of the things to be a clergy person in the Church of England, right, because if the monarch is the supreme governor of the church, part of what it means to be ordained is you actually have to make a vow of loyalty to the monarch, right? Well, if you don't believe that William and Mary are the rightful ascendants to the throne, you can't really do this, all right? Now, you may be wondering, what does this have to do with anything? Well, this is actually pretty important because these people who couldn't swear allegiance to William and Mary, even though they did recognize them as royals, they were like, yeah, I mean, you are a king and queen, just not of England, right? They flee. They're called non-jurors because they couldn't swear allegiance to the monarchs. Okay, so I want y'all to remember that word, non-juror, non-juror. It's a weird word, but let's remember it, okay? They flee to Scotland, okay, because the church says to them, okay, that's cool, y'all don't have to swear allegiance to William and Mary, but if you're going to do that, you can't be clergy anymore here. You got to go somewhere else. So they go to Scotland. There they go. So they flee to Scotland, okay? Unfortunately for them, though, it becomes fiercely Presbyterian shortly after they arrive, okay? Scotland becomes a very Presbyterian country. In fact, actually, the Church of Scotland to this day is Presbyterian. And anyway, so this is probably how they felt about that. Because, now the reason they felt this way about Scotland becoming Presbyterian is because they couldn't practice their expression of Christianity openly at that point. It actually became against the law for them to do this, and so they were sort of driven underground. There were actually laws passed in Scotland that weren't repealed until like the late 1800s, okay? So these laws lasted a while, where if you were a Scottish Episcopalian, if you were a Scottish, one of the descendants of these people, okay, you couldn't gather in a group of more than like 5 or 6 because they were trying real hard to make sure you couldn't be a church, okay? But these Scottish non-jurors are really, really important to our story as Episcopalians because they kept their prayer book, they kept their practices, and as part of that, they kept ordaining people. Okay? They kept ordaining people this whole time, even though they were kind of driven underground in fiercely Presbyterian Scotland. Okay? And they practiced their faith largely in secret. Meanwhile, the English are making their way to the New World at Jamestown and elsewhere, right? I already mentioned William and Mary College in Virginia. They're going all over the place, right? And as they do that, they're bringing their prayer books with them. Maybe not praying out of them all the time, but they are bringing them, okay? They bring their prayer books. And here's where we're going to recap so that we can make sure we know where we are, okay? So, we have Catholic versus Protestant going on in England, Stuarts versus Tudors, Protestant versus even more Protestant, right, with the Puritans. We have this guy, Thomas Cranmer, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury during King Henry VIII's reign. He writes the first Book of Common Prayer, but unfortunately is burned at the stake, right, with his friends Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, as well as 287 other people that Mary, Queen of Scots, burned. Things even out a bit with King James I. We think, okay, we've figured it out until Charles I is killed and the English Civil War happens. The Puritans and Oliver Cromwell take over. Cromwell loses power. Charles II come in, and then we get a new Book of Common Prayer in 1662. After this, the non-jurors flee to Scotland because they can't swear allegiance to William and Mary. Scotland becomes Presbyterian. They don't like the English, so non-jurors must practice in secret. And all this is happening from the 1500s to about 1700. Okay, so that's how many years of history we've just blown through. Woo, and we got to blow through some more real quick. All right. So here we go. Now, we're fast-forwarding to the late 1700s, okay? So I'm ignoring about 75 years here, about 60 years. The colonies are upset, right? They're famously upset. Now, as I mentioned, as the colonies were happening, the English were bringing their prayer books with them, and they were planting churches. So all over, from Georgia on up to New York and whatever, they were planting these churches, and they were Church of England parishes, right? They were still considered part of the Church of England. But all of these folks, or many of them, not the ones in Georgia, they were loyalists, but a lot of the Episcopalians in New England, these folks who were Church of England but were in the colonies, they were getting frustrated and they wanted to rebel, okay? Part of this frustration, we've all heard about no taxation without representation, and that's all well and good, but this is a church presentation here. And so the things that were irritating the church was that we didn't have any bishops over here. So if you were, let's say, in 1750, you were on the vestry of a little Church of England parish in Virginia, and you wanted a priest, you had to go all the way to London to get ordained and then come back because the Bishop of London oversaw all of the colonies. Well, that's a huge expense, and it takes a lot of time, and also you might die, right? Because it's not always a safe voyage. So the colonies, the churches in the colonies just kept petitioning on the Church of England, like, give us bishops. Like, give us a bishop so that we can get priest ordained. Because in order to be ordained a priest, you have to have a bishop, we believe, right? So they were frustrated about this. Oh, wow, I got ahead of myself. There we go. But then, in the midst of this frustration, this happens. All right? Okay, this goes on. So the American Revolution happens. After the war, we all know how it turns out. We're just going to skip over all that. America wins. Okay, so after the war, all of these churches that were formerly part of the Church of England, they were a little bit confused, right? Because they were like, okay, well, what do we do now? Because we're no longer part of the Church of England, right? We just fought a war so that we didn't have to pledge allegiance to the monarch, right? So what do we do? How do we understand ourselves now? Because we're a new thing. Well, that's how we get born. Now, you guys, I dug up, I did a lot of research, as you can tell, for this presentation, and I dug up this archival photo. It's amazing because it's even before photography was invented, but it's an archival photo of the birth of the Episcopal Church. I can't believe I found this. There it is. And we were born, okay? We were born. The Episcopal Church was born. There it is. So, with this, actually, came a lot of questions. We had to figure out, okay, well, if we're a new church, if we're not the Church of England anymore, then how do we work, right? Like, how do we operate? How do we make decisions? How do we decide what it is that we do or believe or whatever? Well, we came up with this idea that was kind of mirrored on the way that the U.S. government would work. And the reason it's mirrored on the way the U.S. government would work is that a lot of people who were trying to figure out how the U.S. government would work were also Episcopalians trying to figure out how the church was going to work. Okay, people like George Washington and many of the founding fathers actually were Episcopalians. And so we came up with this idea that we were going to have a house of deputies and a house of bishops, and that we would gather every so often to discuss and vote and debate and approve things that we wanted to approve, like writing a new prayer book, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And that was mirrored on the idea of the House and the Senate and voting and all of that sort of stuff. So we were a very, and still are, a very democratic denomination. In fact, we are the most, let me make sure I phrase this properly, we are the most representative denominational body in the United States. And what I mean by that is every 3 years, we have this big gathering called General Convention, and it's where we gather to do all this stuff, to talk about things, vote on things, discuss things. And there are representatives from each diocese that go to General Convention. And if you take the proportion of representatives and compare it to the size of our denomination, we have the most representation at General Convention of any other denomination and their similar thing. Does that make sense? I'm not explaining that very well, but I'm not good at math or explaining it. But there it is. So we figured out how we were going to work. We figured out how we were going to talk about things, how we were going to vote on things, what was going to happen. But there was a problem because we still had no bishops, which means no priests, right? If we don't have a bishop, you can't ordain people, and so you can't keep planting churches. And this was a big problem because we were trying to plant churches. You had to go all the way to England still to get ordained, and you probably could imagine the English were not super happy with us at that time, right? And so if you were an Episcopal priest and you wrote to the Bishop of London and were like, hey, I've got this guy in my church, he needs to get ordained, the Bishop of London might be like, yeah, I seem to remember something, though, that just happened, and I'm not too happy about it. And I'm not real sure, I think I'm busy that week when you want to get ordained. So we didn't know what to do. Oh, and here's the other thing, too. You have to have 2 bishops to make 1 bishop. Again, I don't understand this math, you guys. I don't know, but that's just what it takes. You have to have 2 bishops to make 1 bishop. You have to have 1 bishop to make a priest. Okay, there you go. So we needed not just 1 bishop, but we really needed 2 bishops so that then we could make a whole bunch of bishops, right? So, what do? what do we do? What do we do? Because the English didn't want to help us out. Well, who always wants to stick it to the English? The Scottish. That's right. The Scots always want to stick it to the English. And so this is why I spent so much time talking about the Scottish non-jurors, okay? Because they'd been in Scotland hanging out that whole time, doing their thing, and like I said, continuing to ordain people the whole time, right? So this man is someone we need to learn about. This guy his name is Samuel Seaberry. He's got very large sleeves, and he was a priest in Connecticut. Now, before the Revolutionary War, he had actually been a loyalist. He had actually been loyal to the English crown. But after the war, he said, you know what, it's fine. My side lost. I like the States. I'm going to stay over here, right? So he actually goes to the English and asks to be made a bishop, but they say, no, we're not going to do that. And so a plan is hatched where Samuel Seaberry is going to go up to Scotland. I like to believe under the cover of night, but obviously it takes a long time to get to Scotland, so it was under the cover of a lot of nights. But he goes up there where ancestors of those original Scottish non-jurors agree to consecrate him as a bishop. And so he is made a bishop by those guys, okay? And becomes the first bishop in the Episcopal Church. Amazing. So then he comes back to the United States. But there is some division about the fact that he was ordained by the Scots, right? There were certain people in the church who said, that's not how you're supposed to do it. We are descendants of the Church of England, right? And so therefore, what you did was out of order. You needed to go to the English. And so there was this guy, William White, who was a priest in Philadelphia. And in fact, actually, if you go to see like the Liberty Bell and all that sort of stuff, his house is, you can still tour it. It's right there. The William White House is it's a part of the museum complex. But anyway, William White said, no, that's not proper. We need a bishop to be ordained in the English tradition, not in this Scottish tradition. That's not right. And so William White goes to England. Now, the irony here is that White was actually a revolutionary. He was part of the revolution. So remember, Samuel Seaberry was a loyalist, but yet he gets consecrated by the Scottish. White was a revolutionary. But he decides to go to the English because we need 2 bishops to make more bishops. And so William White goes to them. Now the English, they were irritated about what happened with Samuel Seaberry. And if there's one thing that's going to make them mad, right? Just like if there's one thing that the Scots are going to get mad about, it's the English. Well, if there's one thing that's going to irritate the English, it's the Scots. And so the English said, I don't know why y'all didn't just come to us first. We could have done this. I don't know why you went up there. And so they're more amenable to ordaining William White. And so William White is consecrated bishop by the archbishops of York, Canterbury, and the Bishop of Peterborough, and the Bishop of Bath and Wells. And if all of that sounds very fancy, that's because it is. And they were making a statement, right? The English were saying, hey, you shouldn't have gone up and done that with the Scots. This is our guy, right? And so they consecrate William White, and he comes back to the States and becomes the second bishop in the Episcopal Church. Now, even though Samuel Seaberry is the first bishop, William White is the first presiding bishop, and that's just the bishop that kind of presides over General Convention. In the early days of the church, this is like youth table, you're not going to care about this, feel free to tune out. In the early days of the Episcopal Church, the presiding bishop was literally just the one that presided at General Convention and had the gavel and would like call the meeting to order. And that was all they did. They stayed in their diocese. They didn't go to New York and live there or whatever that happens now. But over time, that role changed significantly. And so now, to be presiding bishop, you serve a 9-year term, and you're not bishop of your diocese anymore. You're kind of, it's a different thing. But back then, it just meant that you had to call the meeting to order. So anyway, okay. So a lot happened, right? A lot happened when this went on, because not only did the Episcopal Church get its start this way, but this was also the birth of the Anglican Communion. So as a member of the Episcopal Church, you're also a member of a worldwide communion of churches of almost 80 million people spread all over the globe. that are descendants also of the Church of England. But before we decided to stick it to the English and be our own thing, there was no such thing as the Anglican Communion because we were all just Church of England. But it was like Church of England in Virginia, Church of England in wherever, right? Church of England in North Carolina. But when we became our own thing, the church the actual Church of England had to figure out, well, what does this mean for our relationship? And so we became in communion with them, related to them, brothers and sisters in Christ, but not like the Roman Catholic Church, where, you know, if the Archbishop of Canterbury showed up here at St. Richard's next week, one, that'd be really cool, but two, he couldn't tell any of us what to do, because that's not how the Archbishop of Canterbury works. Whereas if you're a Roman Catholic and the Pope shows up at your church next week, the Pope very much can tell you what to do, because he's the Pope, right? And so it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different. All right. But out of our birth, out of the birth of our denomination, also came the birth of the Methodists. And it all has to do with the thing about ordination. Remember how I said how you had to have a bishop to ordain a priest, and you had to have two bishops to make a bishop? Well, there were some within the church at the time who were just like, this is way too complicated, okay? Way too complicated. And so they came up with a theological justification for priests ordaining other priests, right? Which, actually, there's kind of a biblical argument to be made for that. I shouldn't say that, but whatever, okay? And so, Methodists were born. John Wesley, who was a Church of England clergyman, he was all about mission and zeal and evangelism, and the Church of England was holding that back, was preventing people from hearing the good news of Jesus, was preventing churches from being planted because of this bottleneck that was created around ordination. And so Wesley says, you know what, I'm going to ordain people because I think there's biblical warrant for doing that. And so that's the quote here, is he took matters into his own hands because you ordain people by placing your hands on them. That's right, that's good. No one, okay, all right, okay. So John Wesley starts to do that, and that's honestly why why Methodists are different than Episcopalians today, is because we never were really able to reconcile after we had bishops. We just decided, you know what, we're going to do our own thing, and then there became more differences between us, but we still actually are like cousins. We're denominational cousins, and Wesley was, I think, maybe on to a little bit of something with his missional zeal, because there are a lot more Methodists than there are Episcopalians, aren't there? So, but anyway, so that's how Methodists happen. But in the midst of this, we also had to make our own Book of Common Prayer. Remember, this is technically about how we got the Book of Common Prayer. We had to make our own prayer book because the original one that came from England, we were praying for the monarch. We were praying for the king or the queen. And while that's all well and good to pray for them, because it's good to pray for anybody, it didn't really make sense, right, for us to be praying for the monarch as the head of state. And so we decided we're going to make our own prayer book and adapt it for our use. And so we did that. We had the first prayer book we came up with in 1789, was the first American prayer book. And then we revised it in 1892, 1928, which there are probably some folks in here who used the 1928 prayer book for a while. And then most recently we revised it in 1979, and that's the prayer book that we still use today. There it is. So that's how we got the BCP. And that is also kind of the history of our denomination and how we got here. And I somehow did that in 45 minutes. So, thank you. So, I don't know if that made sense. I don't know if you followed that. There's a whole bunch of stuff I left out, but there it is. That's basically how we got here. So does anybody have any questions in the last about 10 or so minutes that we have together? And I'll turn this on and... Ooh, here, I'm going to hand this... Oh, okay, all right. Why do we use the word Catholic all the time in some of our prayers? That was the question. So that's a great question. And there is a difference in between big C Catholic and little c Catholic. Okay, so the word Catholic itself just means universal. So the Roman Catholic Church, very presumptuously, I think, claims to be the Catholic Church, right? As in, there aren't really others. All the rest of us are kind of like, I don't know, like I'm playing dress up on Sundays, basically, right? Because they are the big C Catholic Church. But the word Catholic just means universal. And so when we say the word Catholic as part of the creed, the Nicene Creed, we are not in the Nicene Creed saying that we as Episcopalians are somehow supporting the Roman Catholic Church. What we're saying is that we believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, right? Meaning that we believe in a universal, the Church universal. So, as Protestants, our understanding of that is a little bit more expansive. We may maybe disagree, for instance, with some of our denominational siblings, but I don't know anyone in this room who would probably look at someone at Palm Valley Lutheran and be like, you're not a real Christian, right? Like I don't think any of us would say that. And that's what we mean when we say that we believe in a Catholic Church, a universal church, right? That we may be different in some ways, we may differ on our understanding of some things, but we believe that other Christians are valid, right? And so that's what we affirm when we say that. But that's a really good question, because if you don't know that, the only other context that you have for that word is the Roman Catholic Church. And you might be like, well, we're not Roman Catholic, right? We're not Catholic in that way. So, great question. Anyone else? That's a really good question also. So the question was, when the Mass was said in Latin, was the sermon at least preached in people's language? And actually, yeah, probably so. Because the sermon was kind of seen as the part that the people did understand. It was seen as sort of the explanation of the gospel or whatever was needing to be proclaimed in the vernacular. And you had certain, so we didn't talk about this at all, but you had, before the Reformation, you had monks and nuns, you had monasteries and holy different orders of monks that were all around, both in continental Europe and also in England. Now, those were destroyed in the English Reformation and disbanded because a lot of them had become very corrupt. I mean, there was reason for that. But there were certain religious orders whose primary task was preaching and teaching. So like the Dominicans were all about preaching and teaching, and they would have gone around and just taught in everyday language. So that's a really good question. But the actual service itself would have been said in Latin. So, yeah, Robin. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's a good question. So Robin asked, there are so many similarities, right? And we mentioned this a little bit. There's so many similarities between kind of what we do and how we do them and what Roman Catholics do. And so what makes us Protestant, right? Why aren't we Catholic? That's a really good question. So there are a couple of reasons, including some just accidents of history, that make what we do resemble Roman Catholic worship more than other Protestant bodies. And I'm happy to talk about those. But the basic answer to your question is what makes us Protestant is our understanding of the role of spiritual authority is different. For instance, like I was mentioning, if the Archbishop of Canterbury shows up at St. Richard's next week, what the Archbishop of Canterbury says is not an order for me. Like, I would actually have to tell the Archbishop of Canterbury, hey, here's how we do it here at St. Richard's, right? Because he has spiritual authority over me in some sense, and over all of us as sort of like a representative of, as a representative of pastoral ministry, but doesn't have the same sort of authority that like the Pope would have, right? If the Pope came, or even just like the local Roman Catholic bishop. Like in January, when Bishop Doyle comes to visit us, Bishop Doyle can make certain requests about I would like to have someone hold my crozier at this point in the service or whatever, and we're happy to do that. But Bishop Doyle can't just come in and dictate everything to us, because that's not his role. His role is pastoral, as opposed to hierarchical in the sense of ecclesial authority that way. Is that making sense? So there's that. It's our understanding of ecclesial authority. It's also our understanding of the sacraments is different. We're going to talk about that in future classes, so that's a little bit of a teaser. But our understanding of the sacraments is different. And the fact that we kind of, I think one of the things that makes us so unique is that, as I was describing early on with the way that the Reformation happened, and in Europe it was like there was the Reformation, and then there was the Reformation of the Reformation, and the Reformation of the Reformation's Reformation, right? And Protestants just kept Protestanting over and over and over. The Church of England sort of was a little more stable because of the fact that it was a state church. And so you did have, for instance, and still do to this day, you've got people in the Church of England who are kind of a little more Protestant. You've got some that are a little more kind of on the Catholic side in terms of their sacramental theology and stuff like that. But they kind of coexist together because they're bound by common prayer, as opposed to being bound by ascribing to one central doctrinal statement or confession. Like if you're a Lutheran, there are certain confessions that you have to uphold and that sort of thing. And we're a little bit different than that. And so we, due to that kind of accident of history, and I think sort of the grace of the Holy Spirit in a way, managed to retain a lot of the beauty and the ritual and the rhythms of the liturgy and the ancient parts of that, while also incorporating some of the, I think, quite right innovations of the Reformation. Anyway, and so there's a guy I didn't mention in here named Richard Hooker who was an important Anglican theologian with an unfortunate last name, but he is credited with kind of talking about the Anglican way as a middle way between Roman Catholicism and like super Protestantism, right? That we're sort of somewhere in between. We're sort of flexible. And scholars now, they also talk about how we're not only a middle way between the Roman Catholic Church and more Protestant churches, we're also a middle way between very, very Protestant churches and, you know what I mean? We're kind of a middle way in the midst of Protestantism as well, because we can kind of coexist with a lot of people. So there's a lot more to say about that in the sessions on sacraments and things like that, but it's a little bit of overview. Yeah. Ooh. Armistead? Yeah. And then we'll start with, yeah, okay. Oh, okay, never mind.
Good thing she wasn't in like an auction.
Whew, that's good. Yeah, that's right. You just bid.
Thing about being able to pray, and I mean, that's one of those unique aspects of the Episcopal Church or Anglican tradition versus some of the more Catholic, where
Yes, yeah.
praying to the Lord a little more directly than
Right.
necessarily you might hear in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that relates really to our. Yes, yeah. That's a good point, and relates actually to that idea of how we understand spiritual authority and the role of an ordained person, right? So one of the innovations of Protestantism was that you don't have to have a priest or some saint or somebody to mediate your prayers to God in the same way, right? And so, for instance, I would hope that none of you in here think that somehow you need me to pray in that way, right? Like you can pray to God and God will hear your prayer, and you know what I mean? You don't, and similarly, my prayers don't somehow count for more than your prayers, right? And that's a Reformation principle. That's not really a Roman Catholic principle. So but it relates to that idea of how we understand spiritual authority and the sacraments. And so there are things like that, for instance. Yeah, that's a really good point. So Armistead, yeah.
In terms of the Reformation, do we have like a hero, similar like Methodists have John Wesley, Lutherans have Martin Luther, Catholics have people like Thomas More?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Armistead asked, do we kind of have like denominational heroes, right? Like Luther, right, for Lutherans, right? Because we're not called Cranmerians, right? We're not named after. And I also, just as an aside, I think we still claim Wesley. He died a Church of England priest, so I still claim John Wesley, despite the protests of Methodists. But I think. But yeah, no, that's a great question. Like, do we have those kind of heroes? So, yes, we do. Cranmer being one, I think, that we don't talk enough about in the life of the church. Also, though, Latimer and Ridley, who were burned at the stake with him, and we have rooms named after at least two of those people, right, across the hall. That's why it's the Ridley room and the Cranmer room are named after both of them. They are both saints and examples that I think we should kind of own more, right? I think part of the reason why we don't is because, one, we're not named after one of them, right? We're not like, and there wasn't like it's not like Cranmer wrote a confessional statement that we ascribe to, as I mentioned. Cranmer wrote a book of prayers that we all pray. It's just a little bit different. And also, I think because even though we are related to the Church of England and we trace our lineage back that way, because we broke away, right, there's this kind of, I think that does something too. We don't talk about those heroes as if they're part of our story in quite the same way, which I think is kind of sad. But yeah, I would say the martyrs of the English Reformation, Cranmer, Latimer, and Ridley are big ones, and there's others. We tend also, too, to be kind of a denomination of bookish people. So we have a lot of like scholars and people who read and wrote stuff, and not as many people who did stuff, which is different, right? The hero of your denomination always needs to be a doer, right? Not just a writer. So you've got, which is why I say like Cranmer, Ridley, and Latimer are important, because they suffered greatly for their faith, actually. But, one of the reasons we don't talk about Richard Hooker all the time is because he just wrote books, right? He was a scholar. He was really important. Same thing with a bishop named William Laud, who was really, really important to the writing of the King James Bible, but he was like a seminary professor. You know what I mean? Like he was a bishop of the church, but, if William Laud had like, I don't know, heroically marched into battle against the Roman Catholics or something, maybe you'd hold him up in a different way. But anyway, that's a good question. Yeah. Anyone else in the 1 minute we have before we end? Yes, Tish. Oh, yeah, Bishop White came before the White House, yes, but yes, yeah. Yeah, no, there is so much more to this story than what we just sort of skated over today. And, like I said, the history of the church is messy. It's really messy. There's a lot of war. There's a lot of killing other people who don't agree with you. It's not clean, But one of the things that I think studying the history of the church helps us see is actually, again, how the through line is really the power and work of the Holy Spirit to overcome human frailty and human division, to continue to do something that looks like the kingdom of heaven, right, in the midst of all of that. And so anyway, I hope that this was at least a little interesting to you today. Oh, yeah, do we have one more question before we go? Why? Yes, Sam Seaberry's sleeves. Why did they look like trash bags? Why do they look like that? Well, so Bishop Doyle's sleeves also kind of look like that. So I'm going to leave you to ask that to him. We'll ask Bishop Doyle why his sleeves look like that, because they look pretty similar. But anyway, yeah, we'll actually talk a little bit about vestments and like why priests wear certain things and what they mean. We'll talk about that in a future class. But that's actually, yeah, it's a good question. So anyway, thanks for joining me this morning. I hope this was interesting. It sort of forms a little bit of a basis for kind of how we got here and why we're here. And then in future sessions, we'll talk about the sacraments and prayer and what this book really helps enable us to do in our spiritual life. So see you then.